All right, guys. Chapter 24, imperialism. Again, another important chapter. I've definitely seen, long essays, DBQs that focus on this topic. So you definitely want to, definitely, put some of these events and facts in your mind. All right, so the first focus would be the motives. Why were European countries, and Asian countries for that matter, in Japan, why were they, colonizing? Why were they expanding into Africa and other parts of Asia? A lot of it had to do with, this is the context to imperialism. There's the Industrial Revolution that is happening right all over the world. So a country like England, they needed raw goods, right, for their textile factories. So, for example, cotton. That's why they're going to be in Egypt, in India, even, they don't have a colony in the United States in 1800, but they're going to rely on American cotton. Again, to fuel those textile mills. Labor. They're going to need, workers. India, for example, the people of India are going to be, cultivating that cotton, for example. They'll need workers in India to build the railroads that are necessary to transport the cotton from India or from Africa into Europe. And a lot of these jobs were very dangerous and the pay was very low. Also, these colonies provided a market for goods. I think that's an easy concept to remember. So not only, were the English, the British making textiles from Indian cotton, they would turn around and sell those textiles back to India. This is really, mercantilism at its, finest, right? The colonies served to not only provide raw goods, but also a market for goods as well. Um, and here it is, right? Again, the colonies provided, those two things: a place to sell goods and a place to extract those resources. And a lot of these were cash crops, right? So it could be tea from India, tobacco, cotton, also tea from China, sugar from those Caribbean plantations, right? As a result, this was devastating for Africa. Because of the English, they were looking to maybe grow one item, for example. So we call these monocultures. So a place like Africa, or a small colony, it got to the point where they were only producing one cash crop. And because of that, the people or that colony would lack some diversity from an agricultural standpoint. They didn't have factories either. So, maybe perhaps a colony like the Congo would only provide, one cash crop for Belgium. And so eventually, when Europeans left, these countries weren't very diverse economically, and that was a problem long term, especially if there was disease or, crop disease that would really devastate an economy if that was the only cash crop. And again, the long-term impact was devastating because of this. The Europeans didn't diversify these African economies. Again, they kind of were pulling the one product out, and when that product was gone, these countries or these colonies were left to really, wither away. Um, Also, and this is really important. Not only would, because of England, for example, would not only extract cotton from India, but um, they would limit the ability of local Indian artisans to make their own textiles, kind of a monopoly, whether it was through law or just basically, pricing. Eventually, British textile companies were, wiped out Indian textile artisans, and that was really a problem. Definitely remember that concept. I've seen that quite a bit on questions. How the parent country limited the manufacturing of the colony, or India especially. And again, what is that leading to? These countries, whether it was India or Africa, as time would go on, they wouldn't be self-sufficient economically, at least in the modern era. So I can't stress that aspect enough. How, again, the colonies' manufacturing industries decline And what would happen is England would resell those goods back to India at high prices because there was really no more competition. Gandhi would actually protest that in the 20th century, where he would encourage the people of India to make their own salt, make their own textiles. And you'll see pictures of Gandhi literally like, making his own clothing, right, as a boycott. All right, railways were very important. England built railways in India and Africa not to help the people of India, move from place to place, but to help extract those resources. Also, make it easier for them to govern these colonies. These railways helped them fight local wars with native people, and yes, they were there were jobs for native workers, but the jobs or the conditions were dangerous and the wages were very low. Cecil Rhodes, you might see him in a document. He owned the Beers Diamond Company, and he had the idea to build a railroad from South Africa to Egypt. Again, the idea would be to help him extract his resource. It was never built. But it's just another example of how Europeans were trying to kind of, really just dominate the economies of Africa and India. So again, De Beers Diamonds, Cecil Rhodes. As far as labor goes, not only were the native people working on those railroads, in those fields, but often many of the local workers would leave. So Indian workers would often leave India and work in the Caribbean or Fiji. You're gonna, if you know much about Indian history, the country of Guyana was originally a British colony. Many people from India or native Indians moved to Guyana to work in that British colony. Chinese and Japanese workers left, sometimes seasonal. They would take seasonal jobs in Hawaii or Cuba. Many were indentured servants. We've talked about that in the Americas, right? Chinese workers would work. They would work to pay off their transportation debts. Penal colonies, definitely an important concept to remember. Again, I've seen this quite a bit. Convicts from England and Ireland were often sent to Australia and India to basically work, kind of kick them out while working. As laborers, they could earn their freedom, but the problem is they would spread disease off to the Aborigine societies, especially in Australia. An Aborigine society would be a native group in Australia, the Aborigines. England also has tried to send Irish convicts to the Cape Colony in South Africa, but local settlers who were already there, British farmers or Dutch farmers who had been there for many years, were opposed to that, and eventually these convicts ended up on the island of Tasmania. So the idea of a penal colony, again, if we're talking about labor migration, that's a great example or evidence of workers moving. So we had the African slaves during the Atlantic trade era, indentured servants from Europe going to the Americas. Don't forget, again, the convicts from England and Ireland going to India and Australia. The effect of that would be the cultural transfers, right? So these British or Irish would bring their religions, their customs, their food, their languages, especially Indian workers, right? We're going to see Indian culture on the island of Fiji and in Trinidad off the coast of, I believe, South America. So definitely we're seeing that as well. And that's not, we saw that with Irish immigrants to the United States, right? Bringing their Catholic religion, bringing, African peoples, bringing, Islam to the Americas, dance, music from their African world. So definitely a common theme throughout when it comes to migration. What were the political motives for imperialism? If you're arguing what the main motive, you have to go with economics. But there was a political motive too, and a lot of that would be nationalism to kind of spread your not spread, but it was kind of something. It was competition, right? Trying to outdo. England would try to outdo the Germans or the Belgians. Again, it was kind of a source of national pride at the time to have colonies. Sounds kind of weird, but that was important to increase unity in a country, right? Kind of a win in a sense. This seeking out of colonies for nationalistic purposes. A great way to explain it would be the historical term would be the scramble for Africa. That would be a great term to use in an essay. Again, they were scrambling to kind of seize these colonies to, again, increase their nation's pride. Japan was involved in it too. They sought to expand into Korea and Taiwan. So again, that's a key term, the scramble for Africa. But again, it was a sign of national pride to have many colonies across the world, especially for the English. The ideological motives. Definitely remember the concept of social Darwinism. If you've ever heard of Charles Darwin, he had this belief that it came to the natural world, right? That some species would survive and others would not. Those that were fit would survive. Those that were not would either adapt or die off, and that was just God's way. It was natural, right? And that was applied to society. Social scientists would use it to justify colonization, this idea that native people were unfit, and that Europeans were superior, and the superior people were justified in taking over. They would attempt to assimilate, right? To educate, to Christianize the native peoples, and if the native peoples didn't, survive, well, that was just God's way in a sense. So it was also used to argue that these people were, governable. It was used to justify a military takeover. So again, definitely remember this ideological motive. I've seen it on many tests going forward. To kind of uplift the people of Africa and India, missionary work was done to Christianize the native people, often provide medical attention, education. So that's going to be common. So again, I think that goes hand in hand that, Europeans believed they were superior, but yet they believed that it was their duty to uplift the people. Sometimes you'll hear the term the white man's burden. That could be a primary source. It's a famous, I think it's an essay. This idea that, white Christians had a duty to, they were justified in taking over, but they had a duty to uplift the people. It was their burden, right, to help the people that they were almost conquering. All right, a little bit about English or European intervention or colonization in India or South Asia. Remember, the Portuguese are the first to enter this part of the world. They set up trading posts in India. Remember Vasco da Gama. Eventually, the British East India Company, they're going to kind of move in. They're going to they're going to be the ones to kind of dominate the cotton market. They're going to push Indian textile artisans out of business. We talked about that, right, to limit competition. And eventually those British textile companies would, pull the cotton out of India and resell finished goods from England back to India at inflated prices. So it's a true monopoly that really impacted the people of India negatively. Here's Gandhi right here. This was his way of boycotting the English dominance over the Indian markets. He basically encourages followers to, again, make their own clothing. Salt too, make their own salt. Salt was another good that the English were forcing the, English salt, forcing the Indian people to buy that. We're going to talk more about Gandhi in the next unit, but he's going to resist, this monopoly through nonviolent protest. Important event, they might ask you or provide examples of colonial rebellion. And the Sepoy Mutiny or the Indian, rebellion of 1857 is a great example of that. So Sepoys were Indian soldiers who were under British control, but they rebelled when they were forced to use rifles that were greased with the fat of cow and pigs. Remember, that goes against their Hindu beliefs. They believed the British were trying to maybe, subtly convert them to Christianity or move them away from Hinduism, and the response was to revolt, and the British response was pretty brutal. And what that ended up doing is the Sepoys were defeated, and that just increased British control. Eventually, the colonial government would have to take direct orders from London. The people of India wouldn't be able to travel throughout India without special passes. They had very few political rights in their own country, and that's going to lead to Gandhi's political movement in the early 1900s. So definitely remember the Sepoy Mutiny. Again, it had to do with soldiers being forced to use weapons that were basically greased with cow and pig fat. All right, moving on to China. We talked in the last unit about the Opium War. That's a great example of colonial resistance. It ended up in defeat and only strengthened the British hold on China. Remember the Treaty of Nanjing. The British gained Hong Kong as a colony, and there were more ports open to trade, and the British citizens had that extraterritoriality, right? Those extraterritoriality rights gave them a lot of autonomy in China. Then there was the Sino-Japanese War, if you recall. The Japanese and Chinese were going to war. The Japanese defeated the Chinese, and that gave them the island of Taiwan. So this would be a great example of Japanese expansionism. Even though, Japan was becoming a huge imperial power during this time. The term sphere of influence is very important. China was kind of broken up into smaller colonies, and so the idea would be, maybe the British didn't have a huge colony in China outside of Hong Kong, but they had a lot of influence in China. The French, though, did colonize Indochina or Vietnam. The Germans and Russians also had parts of northern China, and the U.S. established something called the open door policy. So the U.S. didn't have necessarily a colony in China, but they had a lot of influence in China. And this open door policy basically told Europeans to keep China open to trade. So I guess you could say the U.S. was a little more understanding and a little more sympathetic to the Chinese, but make no mistakes, the U.S. saw a trading opportunity by keeping China fairly autonomous. But there was a lot of influence, and that's another good term, right? We talked about the scramble for Africa. Well, China, the colonial term would be sphere of influence. Famous cartoon, you might see it, right? All the European powers, Queen Victoria, probably von Bismarck, I would assume. French woman, here's your Japanese emperor perhaps, or shogunate, German guy, Russian guy, I assume, and then here's your Chinese, your Qing representative, right? The Boxer Rebellion, a great example of foreign opposition, 1899. We talked about this. The Righteous Harmonious Fist go after Westerners, but a multinational force led by the U.S. and England puts that down, and that only opens China up to more westernization. So again, a great example of imperialism, but also rebellion, right? Anti-imperial responses by native people. So remember the Boxer Rebellion, the Opium War, and the Sepoy Mutiny as some of those examples of anti-imperialism opposition. All right, let's move on to Africa. Dr. Livingstone, you might see him as a source of something. Basically, he is kind of like one of not the first, but he's very against the slave trade, and he travels to the middle of Africa to kind of, open up trade to Christianity, open up Africa to Christianity and trade. He kind of disappears, and he's located by Henry Stanley. Stanley is asked to go down there and find Livingstone, and the famous line is when Stanley finds Livingstone, it's Dr. Livingstone, I presume. It's more of a symbolic event. Again, they're not the first Europeans into Africa. Obviously, the Portuguese were, but it is kind of a Commodore Perry moment, if you recall. An Englishman stepping into Africa and opening that door further. The Congo. The Congo is colonized by Belgium in 1875. King Leopold, definitely remember him. He's a great symbol of European imperialism. He hired Stanley to explore as well, and as a colony, the Belgians put the people of Congo pretty much into slavery, even though it wasn't slavery. Family members would be held hostage if men weren't working, and overall between 3 and 8 million workers perished under Leopold's oversight. So, definitely a great example of the oppression that Europeans often put African people under when it came to colonization. So that's King Leopold. The French conquered Algeria. Not only did the French kind of control Indonesia or Vietnam and Cambodia, but they also had a colony here in North Africa, Algeria. That could be an example of, could be a source or an image. They also had colonies in West Africa, right here, French West Africa, and East Africa, right over, somewhere over here, where the French, Madagascar, I guess, right here, more central, I suppose. One problem is that when the Europeans went into Africa, they didn't really have any concern with ethnic boundaries. So, for example, the French might take over a region and end up naturally putting two opponents or two different groups together as neighbors in a sense. Maybe they had always been separated by natural boundaries, and now they were almost put together. Natural enemies were forced to live together. And that's going to be a problem down the road when the Europeans leave. That's going to lead to a lot of civil war. Rwanda is a great example of that. Rwanda is right over here, I believe. There he goes, right through here. It was a Belgian colony, right through here near the Belgian Congo. So the Tutsis, and we'll learn more about this in the next unit, they were a minority group. They were lighter skinned. It had a lot to do with it. And they were treated better by the Belgians because of that. They were given better jobs, better education. And the majority ethnic group, the Hutus, who were darker skinned, were resentful of that. Again, it's the Belgians kind of putting these two groups together, even though they had been separated for many years. And eventually, the Hutus, when the Belgians leave, the Hutus would pretty much take over, and there would be a horrible genocide. We'll watch a great film about that after the exam. This genocide occurred in 1993 under Bill Clinton's presidency, or during the Clinton presidency, and really it was horrible. And I think the sad part is, Europe, the United States, kind of didn't do anything. We allowed it to happen, and I think historically speaking, that was kind of a black mark on our country, that we allowed this horrible genocide to occur. But again, we're going to learn more about that down the road. But that's the Rwandan genocide. But again, that's a great example of Europeans kind of ignoring those ethnic boundaries that occurred and, putting these groups together under one, colonial government. And during that colonial period, there might not have been a problem, but once those Europeans left, well, you know what? Now you're going to have really some violent civil wars. That's a great image of some of the destruction during the Rwandan genocide. So again, powerful film we'll watch in a couple months called Hotel Rwanda. All right, the Suez Canal, kind of a symbol of colonialism. The canal was built in the late 1800s. It would help trade between the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and obviously the Indian Ocean. Still exists today. A lot of Egyptian workers, I believe, probably during the Ottoman Empire, were put to work. Remember those corvée laborers. The British, though, took control in 1882, and that's kind of the moment where the British are now really have a huge, have a tremendous influence in this region economically. They take control of that canal mostly so that they can control the trade going between the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. Later in the 50s, there'd be a battle between the Egyptians and the British that almost kind of, resulted in, a major world war, actually, in the 50s. The United States actually kind of intervened and kind of calmed tensions down between the Egyptians and the British. And the Egyptians had kind of recruited the Soviets to kind of help them a little bit. So we'll get to that one down the road, too. But the Suez Canal is a kind of an important example of that growing imperialism, the British taking control of that canal that was built by Egyptians. The Berlin Conference, another great example of a symbol of imperialism. Great example of that scramble for Africa. 1884, European powers come together in Berlin, Germany, to kind of pretty much set rules for colonization to avoid, kind of colonial wars between the powers. The problem was there was no African representation, and it really ended up being a carving up party of Africa, as you can see in the cartoon. So I would definitely remember the Berlin Conference as, again, a symbolic moment, a turning point in the history of Africa, but kind of a negative effect on the people of Africa. All right, South Africa. Today, South Africa is a unique place, a very diverse country. In the 90s and 80s, there was a huge, almost civil war between the African people and the European ancestors. If you've ever heard of Nelson Mandela, he led a revolution, a civil rights movement in a sense, to end segregation and discrimination in South Africa by the white minority. Anyway, going back in history, it was originally a Dutch colony, but in the 1800s, the British took South Africa for themselves. Between 1811 and 1858, there was another rebellion. The English were fighting the native people of the Xhosa. The Xhosa were African, were an African ethnic group. And what's interesting is the Xhosa, to resist, and here's a great example of resisting, they actually destroyed their own livestock. The British believed that the livestock was spreading disease. The British killed the livestock. They killed the cattle. They destroyed crops too. They believed that. I apologize. Let me go back. The British had brought livestock almost like in exchange to South Africa, and the Xhosa believed that the livestock were spreading disease. Actually, they were. So the Xhosa killed the cattle and destroyed crops to kind of induce spirits to destroy the British. So unfortunately that led to a famine. So again, the local native people are destroying their own, crops and cattle, again, in an attempt to hurt the British. So the Xhosa cattle killing movement had kind of adverse effects, but it is an example of rebellion or resistance. Then there's the Anglo-Zulu War in the 1870s, the Zulu Kingdom, in and around this part of South Africa along the Indian Ocean. The British went to war with the local Zulu people, very, indigenous groups, not a mixed group of African and European Dutch. And the win or the victory gave the British control of this part of South Africa through here. Okay, so again, examples of resistance, right? The Zulu native people going to war with the British, or the Xhosa cattle killing movement. Try to remember one or two of those. The Boer Wars, another example of conflict. It's interesting though, this was not a conflict between native African peoples. Actually, it would be the British going to war with Dutch, descendants of those Dutch colonizers, and African. So it's a combination of European, Dutch, and African peoples coming together to fight the British. Mostly because of discovery of metals and diamonds. There was this battle over land. The British wanted to control those diamond mines, and the Afrikaners believed they were the original owners of that land. The Afrikaners were put into concentration camps in many cases, devastating, but mostly for the black camps. So the Afrikaners and the Africans were actually separated, and the black camps were considered to be much harsher. But either way, it's a great example of the English using some pretty intense methods to control the local people. And afterwards, both the Afrikaner and Africans were put onto kind of worthless land. Leading to a lot of resentment going into the modern era, which eventually would lead to kind of a rebellion between the African peoples, and eventually the South African government would be independent of England, and that would be who Mandela would fight. All right, so what about Southeast Asia? The Dutch were controlling the Indonesia region. If you recall, the Dutch East India Company kind of had a trading monopoly in Indonesia. We also call the Dutch East India Company the VOC. If you see that those initials, again, they tried to control the Spice Islands. Eventually, though, the VOC or Dutch East India Company went out of business, and the government of the Dutch government, Netherlands, took over, right? Kind of state control, right? And then you have the Dutch East Indies. What was being taken out of this region? Tea, rubber, sugar. Interesting as a result of that. Again, here's a great example of kind of what we saw in India. The Dutch would limit the native people in terms of what they could produce, kind of forcing the people of Indonesia to produce sugar or rubber, and limited rice production, which actually really hurt local Indonesian farmers who were actually ended up being put out of business. Good example of the negative effect at the local levels. The French kind of controlled North Vietnam. They defeated the Chinese in the Sino-French War. Again, that gave them access to Indochina or North Vietnam. You might see Indochina, it's another term for Vietnam. By 1900, the French controlled Cambodia, Laos, and all of Vietnam. The cash crop was rubber. Eventually, though, the communists would emerge in Indochina in the 50s, led by a guy named Ho Chi Minh. They would actually force the French out in a war, and the United States would take over and fight that same communist movement into the 60s and 70s, and we know how that turned out, right? So again, the French were colonizing in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Know your geography, right? This would be Southeast Asia. Here are your Indonesia islands, Singapore, Bali, some great surfing on these islands. Malaysia right here. Here's Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand right there next to Cambodia and Laos. And then right across from the Bay of Bengal is India. And here's China right over here. Taiwan right in here. Korea is going to be out of the picture, but kind of know your Asian region. So remember, East Asia right here, Southeast Asia right in through here. Here again is kind of the sphere of influence, right? So remember, China was kind of controlled by many groups, right? China itself was a republic, but again, the French kind of had control here of perhaps parts of southern China. The British had control of this region. Hong Kong was a British colony. The Germans had a little part of China. Mongolia was pretty much on its own by 1912, the old Mongol region. And then the Japanese controlled this part of China called Manchuria, and eventually Korea. So again, China, a large portion of it was independent or under the Republic, but parts of it were kind of, again, under the influence of European countries, the sphere of influence. All right, what about U.S. imperialism? The Monroe Doctrine, 1823, James Monroe issues this. It's basically a policy. It's a statement to Europeans to basically stay out of the Americas. It masked our desire to have colonies. It was an easy way of kind of, keeping our influence established. It was a threat. It was a direct threat to Europe, an indirect threat to Europe to stay out of this region. We never really engaged in war. Specifically with any of these, any European country, at least until the Spanish-American War. That's another great example of U.S. imperialism. We studied that during U.S. 1. Remember, we defeat the Spanish and we gain control of the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. We annexed the Philippines after the Filipino War. If you recall, that was Emilio Aguinaldo who went after Americans in the Philippines, but we defeated Aguinaldo and the rebellion, and eventually we annexed the Philippines. It's under our control until the 50s when we give the Filipinos their independence. And then, today Puerto Rico is a commonwealth, not a colony, but a commonwealth. But these were for maybe not by definition colonies, but they were basically colonies for many years of the United States. We had military bases. They were markets for our products, right? We controlled the trade there as well. And then in 1904, the Roosevelt Corollary, it's an extension of the Monroe Doctrine. Teddy Roosevelt kind of makes the same statement to Europeans. He said that we're basically going to, our influence is supreme in this region. He also basically... he didn't threaten, the Caribbean region, but he did, he did make the statement that that, for example, the Dominican Republic, they had to pay their debts off. Um, and if they didn't, that we actually ended up using our military to kind of seize control of the Dominican and get them to kind of help them with those debts. Our fear would be that those European colonies would come knocking and want their debts paid. So we kind of intervened militarily to kind of keep Europeans out. But again, for the most part, the Dominican Republic was almost like a colony for ours. All right, some examples of resistance that we haven't mentioned. The leaders of the Indian rebellion movement, they were educated. Same thing in Africa. That was the one, I guess, benefit that many people in these places were able to travel to Europe and get an education. The Indian National Congress was formed, very important. Remember, 1885. It was basically kind of an Indian government that they would, again, come together to air their grievances and maybe kind of communicate those grievances to the crown. Their goal was self-rule. Eventually, they would get it in the early 1900s. Mohandas Gandhi would actually become a member. He would lead this Congress, and using boycott and protest, they would eventually gain independence. They actually pretty much crushed the economy of England by boycotting English goods. And that was the whole purpose of the movement. So the Indian National Congress, kind of like, we had that, Martin Luther King had the Southern Leadership Conference, the SLC. We had, African Americans in the United States had those kind of organizations to, again, unite the people of India, unite them in protest. Very important. Pan-Africanism emerges in the United States. It's a cultural movement in the U.S. and Europe. W.E.B. Du Bois, if you remember him, or if you've ever heard of Marcus Garvey, these were, African-American leaders who kind of encouraged African-Americans to kind of celebrate their ancestry, right? And Marcus Garvey actually had an idea to bring African-Americans back to Africa. He actually bought a steamship to bring African-Americans to Liberia. He ended up going to jail for, I think, tax evasion or something, but he is considered kind of an American who kind of back to Africa movement leader. And then the idea again would be to kind of help, develop or initiate an African independence movement. But in America, there was, I guess, especially Du Bois, this idea of celebrating African roots. We see that in the Harlem Renaissance, right? Kind of this push to remember where you came from. All right, guys, that's it.